All right. Good to have you back. My name's Dave Page, and by God's grace, we've been able to start 3 churches, and this is about launching large. And 2 out of the 3 I started were large churches. The last one was just out for about a year and a half, and then went into coaching other church planners. And so I'm thrilled to be part of a conference like this. I want to thank Ron and Teddy. I want to thank Jim Cowart, Jim and Jennifer, who just, Jim's gone on and grown as a leader and done a tremendous job, and Jennifer right with them. I appreciated what Randy said about the marriage, and I don't know about you guys that have planned it, I could not have done it without my wife. I mean, my wife was my right-hand person, my biggest support. We were a team each time, and so I really encourage that. That is how Jennifer is with Jim, and Jim's done a great job. And part of this thrill for me is not only to teach, I love to teach, but to be able to teach and coach guys like Jim, and this is Mark Lee. And Mark we got together about 3 years ago. They started a church, and just to be able to work with some really humble but brilliant people who God calls to plant a church. And so Mark's one who did it. So tell them a little bit about your story, Mark, and Vantage Point Church.
Well, like Dave said, my name is Mark Lee. I planted a church in Southern California about 3 years ago. And can I say this? I'm probably the youngest out of all the presenters. I'm probably the most inexperienced out of all the presenters. I don't think I even have the best hair out of all the presenters, because I think that goes to Matt Keller. But let me tell you this, our church is about 3.5 years old, and I remember 4 or 5 years ago sitting exactly where you're sitting. Man, full of hopes, full of dreams, full of vision, and I was absolutely scared to death. Is there anyone here who's scared to death? Go ahead and raise your hands. Yeah. I mean, I was so scared. I read through every one of those boring Ed Stetzer books.
Ooh.
I went through every church planting thing that I could possibly go through, and by God's grace, I cannot believe that today that I get to share the same stage with guys like Dave Page and Hal Mayer and Jim and Matt Keller and Ron Sylvia. Ron freaking Sylvia. It's like Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Ron Sylvia. I'm not saying he's a part of the Godhead, but I'm saying that I just can't believe that in the 3 years that God has had me do this, that we've probably seen hundreds of people come to Christ. We've seen hundreds of people baptized. We have about 700 people in our church. And you have to understand that the reason why I planted a church is because in my whole Christian life, I don't think I'd seen more than a handful of people come to Christ. More than a handful of people. And I was desperate to see God do something. And I didn't want it to be in somebody else's ministry where I got to look through the window. I wanted to be able to say that God used me to be a part of that. So thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mark. And Mark, you talked about being scared. I'm concerned when somebody's not scared. When we're doing an assessment, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
And somebody's planting a church and they're going into a new area, and they're really not very scared. They don't have fear. And so if you don't have fear, I think there's something wrong. Humanly, you're going to experience fear. But being able to push through that and have courage that God is greater than the fear, and He's going to help us through it. Amen. So that becomes the key. An interesting a point in all of this was the way I met Mark. He came to a teaching in a boot camp I was doing. And he asked if we could talk about it. So I said, yeah, let's go out to lunch. We went out to a Mexican restaurant in Southern California, and I started kind of seeing where he was at. And he had a core group. How many did you have in your core group?
Yeah, I had about 30 in my core group. And when I met with Dave, I was one of those people that I think Jim was talking about with, what was it? Pretty much dumb enthusiasm, I think. Because Dave came to me and he said, so how many people do you want to have at your first preview service? And I was thinking big, man. I'd been a part of a church plant that just kind of oozed into existence, barely ever got off the ground. So I told him, you know what, Dave? I think I want 150, 200 people at my first preview service. And what did you say?
And then I said, well, why do you think you're going to have that many?
Because I'm prayed up, Dave. I'm prayed about this.
He said, I said, how many in the core group? He said, 30. I said, and you think you're going to have 150? What have you done to gather 150? Well, nothing. Why? How do you think you're going to get that? Well, I think each one will invite somebody. I said, well, that would be 60. How do you get 150? And it was just kind of silent.
I have faith.
And I just said, Mark, the way it is right now, this was like 3 months out, wasn't it?
Yeah, maybe,
3 or 4?
Maybe it was about 6 months out.
6 months out? So I said, you're not going to have 150. But you could have 150. In fact, you could have more than 150. And I think that got you intrigued. And then we went down this road, and we started meeting on a regular basis and carved out what Jim Coward talked about, having a strategy and a timeline and funding. We carved out then the strategy, and that's what we're looking at now, is the launching large previews. And then we did the timeline, and we put it all together. And tell them what happened, just in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important to be able to have this strategy. We all have vision as to where we want to go and where we think God wants to take us. We've all heard the statistics of, that if you don't break 200 in your first couple years, you may not be able to. So I had point A, I had point B, but I just did not know how to get there, except for faith, except for prayer. And then what Dave helped me do is Dave helped me work through a strategy of how it is we were going to get there. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. This is more the nuts and bolts stuff of how you get from where you're at to how it is to where you're going. So, I just got fired up for a second. What was your question?
That's okay. No, we'll get to it in just a minute.
So we had about 220 at our first preview service.
220, and they went from there. We're going to get into the previews. So we just want to emphasize this is a strategy. We want to walk you through that strategy. You're going to have it. You're going to have what Mark had. But then what's really helpful to have is a coach, somebody who can oversee and say, hey, no, don't do that. Do this. And they start letting out some rope as you go down the line, and they start encouraging. Now, I'm teaching with Mark. It's 3 years out. But at the beginning, it was like, Mark, here's step 1, here's step 2, here's step 3. Further on, then it was like, well, Mark, what do you think? Well, yeah, that's a good point, but do it this way. Then it was like, Mark, what do you think? And yeah, do it your way. And then it was that, boy, Mark, way to go. You're doing a great job. And so this is a process of going through. So I'd encourage you to get a coach from your denomination, from somebody who's done it, who's been in the trench and can help walk through it with you.
And just a point with that, when you're a man with a plan or when you're a woman with a plan, a couple things that it does is this. Not only do you have a well thought out pattern as to how you're going to get from point A to point B, but let me tell you this. When you get to your launch team meeting, and when you at least sound like you know what you're talking about and that you've thought this thing through, you got some people, you have some investors who are that much more bought into what you're doing. Because if you have some professionals on your team, let me tell you this, the respect factor is going to go way up when you're able to stand up there and say, hey guys, this is where we're going, this is the plan, these are the benchmarks, and this is how we're going to get here. Who's in with me and who's going to be doing what? If you do that, let me tell you, it not only gives focus to you, but it raises the respect level, the credibility, and the buy-in factor that your launch team has with you because they want to do something. And if you just say, hey, well, we're just going to kind of pray, that's something, but they want to be a little bit more hands-on with what you're doing.
Huge credibility. Let's look at the notes. First of all, church plant method, you have a lot of different choices there. From these different methods here, some churches are planted through splits, not the best way, but God can even redeem that. Through a mother church, it's great. Mark had a mother church that really invested in them in a lot of different ways, and not so much financial, but as far as sending core team people, which was financial in some other ways. House churches, great church plants, literally, sometimes parachute in. But then we want to talk about the launching large and as a model. And then some guys are NASCAR church planners. You know those guys. They have sponsors from all over. Whoever gives them money, we're that, we're this. It's kind of a hodgepodge. But when starting a new church, I'd encourage you, pick a model, not a step. So pick a model. And what it really comes down to is not just a model, but are then you going to launch large or are you going to launch small? Which way are you going to go? And we encourage launching large. And I think you have to ask the question, Mark, why launch large? Why should somebody here, why should they launch large?
Well, I think one of the reasons why you launch large, and as you begin to pick your philosophy, I think one of the things you have to do is you have to understand who you are too. I think you have to have a philosophy that matches who you are. And I think you have to have a philosophy that matches the demographic of the type of people that you're trying to reach. See, part of the reason why we almost felt like we had to have a launching large philosophy was that we're in Southern California. We were going into an area, a brand new developing area. Businesses, churches, everybody saw the promise of a brand new community. But as we were going into that community, it was suburbia to the T, where it was a graveyard for church plants. Everyone was going into that area, everyone was not doing well, and everyone was dying. And we thought, well, what's the common denominator between all of these churches? Well, all of these churches are launching kind of small. They have a worship leader up there who can't sing. They got 2 crappy speakers. They got, they're not really doing very much in this area. And I'm not trying to dog that. I'm not saying there's a right way to do ministry and a wrong way to do ministry. But what I am saying is this, that church philosophy did not match the demographic of my community. You come into my community, and guess what? You're going to have a 4,000 square foot, 1-story house. They're big houses, they're new schools, they're big streets, they're big parks, and people are moving in there with the promise of a brand new life. It doesn't matter how much money you have, because we know that poor people can still buy nice houses. Back in that economy, they could. And so
Not anymore.
We knew that our philosophy, that launching large, had to fit the demographic of our community, and that's one of the things that we chose. That was one of the benefits of doing what we did.
And yet, I would push back on that. That worked for you, and that works in suburbia, but what if it's a Hispanic launch?
Sure.
What if it's a Filipino, where you're going against some culture, and where within certain cultures, 50 would be a large launch. And so sitting there like I've done to convince somebody and say, there's an advantage for you even within the culture and the way you've done it over years, or your denomination has done it, or your culture has done it, for you to launch large. Because launching large, bottom line, is reaching as many people as you can for Jesus Christ. That's the bottom line. That's why we launch large. And your main goal, your main focus for the church, foundational focus, should be growth. It should be gathering as many people as you can so you can share the gospel with them so they can come to know Christ. That's our focus. So how do you do that? That's what we're going to look at. We're looking at the why right now. Rick Warren said, if the church doesn't grow to 200 mark within the first year and a half, chances are it never will. Now, we've found that's about 2 to 3 years. So if a church doesn't grow beyond 200, break that 200 barrier. 200 barrier really is from about 150 to about 250. So if it doesn't break through that barrier within the first 3 years, chances are it never will. Are you beginning to understand the urgency in which it takes to grow a church beyond that? Now, does God want every church to be that? I don't know, but I do know He wants churches to grow and reach as many as they can for Christ. And so one way to do that, and I think probably the best way, is to launch large and to